Good day. Even as I make this program, the big news story, the big international news story, are reports of some kind of attempted coup in Germany. Now, I have to say that the words Germany and coup would once upon a time have seemed to me completely bizarre. Once upon a time, long ago, I was an eager student of German history, and I can remember from my studies a time in the 1920s when, in fact, there were various attempts at coups in Germany, military coups. Those who follow the rather good German TV series Babylon Berlin will find in the first series of that TV drama, a case of an attempted or at least planned coup that was supposed to take place in the year 1928. That is fiction, but there were actually real attempts at coups in Germany in the 1920s, the Kapp Putsch, the events which took place in Munich, in the beer hall, which involved a certain well-known personage, whose name I always avoid in these programs for all kinds of reasons connected with the platform I'm on. And there were other attempts and plans and plots and schemes from that period also. But this new talk of a coup in Germany seems to me to have a fantastic quality. I know that discontent in Germany is indeed rising, especially in the former East Germany, but the idea that there was a serious, real attempt to organize a coup in Germany, I find very difficult to believe. Anyway, at the moment, the news is thin. I'm not going to discuss it further. I'm going to wait and see what the further developments are. Now, I'd like to just turn to the video I did yesterday, and I'd like to take this opportunity to correct two mistakes. Now, the first mistake is one which I'm afraid I do apologize for, but it's the kind of mistake I'm very likely to make. I referred to 60 nm microchips as 60 micron microchips. I'm afraid, as everybody who follows me knows, I am the least technical of people. This is the sort of thing I don't understand at all. And as several people pointed out, 60 nm does not mean 60 microns, and I can only apologize for that error. I think those who follow the program nonetheless understand the gist, the point I was trying to make. The Russians have the necessary technologies and the necessary industrial processes to make the kind of chips that their hypersonic missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles and all the rest need. And there are more powerful, more advanced microchips than that, which the Russians for the moment don't make, but it does seem that they are in the process of developing the technologies to make those, and the industrial processes to make those sorts of chips as well. And, well, straightforwardly, production of cruise missiles, subsonic, hypersonic, and all of that is not going to run into those kind of technical limits that some people in the West expected. So that's the essential point that I was making. Now, the other error is actually, in my opinion, a more serious one. It's a reporting error. And it comes from the fact that for some time, reports coming out about the Ukrainian missile strikes with these converted Soviet-era reconnaissance drones, reports were very garbled. So I spoke about the fact that several technicians were killed over the course of the shooting down of one of these Ukrainian missiles. And some of these technicians were killed at the giant Engels air base. That was actually wrong. it seems those technicians were actually killed at the other airbase in Ryazan, which is a less important airbase. I will say this, however, that I think my essential point, that from a Russian point of view, the fact that the Ukrainians were able to launch these long-range strikes on these two air bases is a concerning matter that I will continue to insist upon. And in fact, a few hours later, Putin convened a meeting of his Security Council, and the readout was very brief. It said that national security issues were on the agenda and were being discussed. And of course, I've no doubt that it was the attack on the bases that will have been the major topic of discussion, and we will no doubt be seeing over the next few weeks the various Russian attempts to counter these strikes, these Ukrainian strikes. I would say, by the way, that I've been reading some rather excited commentary in the West about these strikes. There's some people who seem to think that these are a game-changing event. I want to make it clear that I don't think they are. I think that the Ukrainians were able to take the Russians perhaps a bit by surprise by launching these long-range strikes against Russia. But the technology used is old. The missiles used were converted Soviet-era reconnaissance drones, hardly ideal for use as cruise missiles. Easy to detect, relatively easy, I would have thought, to shoot down. They travel in a straight line. They're not stealthy or anything like that. I've no doubt at all that the Russians will be able over the next few weeks to develop mechanisms to deal with these sorts of missiles. Several people have pointed out to me that the Ukrainians tried to use these converted Soviet-era drones early in the war. One of them landed in Croatia, and I've had a really rather interesting email from a Croat member of the community, for which I would like to say thank you, in which this person informed me of the enormous impact that this missile strike, or accidental missile strike, had in Croatia, and how close it came to causing a real tragedy there. It only missed a civilian complex. By chance, it came very close to striking at that complex. And of course, the Ukrainians have clearly struggled to get these drones into a sort of operational position. Probably the Russians downplayed their ability to do so. But as I said, these are not effective weapons. One mustn't compare them with the far more effective, far more capable drones, subsonic, supersonic, like the Onyx, hypersonic, like the Zircon and the Kinzhal, which the Russians have. Even the subsonic drones, as I understand it, are able to carry out aerial maneuvers, which makes it much more difficult for surface-to-air missiles to shoot them down. And the Ukrainians yesterday were claiming that they shot down 60 out of the 70-plus cruise missiles, or subsonic, that the Russians launched against them. Once again, I cannot square Ukrainian arithmetic amongst the number of missiles Ukraine claims it shot down with the number of missiles Ukraine claims were launched, which was 70, just over 70, and the number of targets actually hit. By the way, whilst I'm on the topic of the nature of the attacks, I said yesterday that Western reporting that this was a less effective attack than some of the others perhaps reflected the fact that these particular missile attacks do not seem to have been centered on Kiev, that they were attacks mainly focused on other areas of Ukraine. And in fact, a few hours later, the Russians claimed that there were no missile strikes, no missile attacks on Kiev at all. None of the missiles that the Russians launched, the Russians say, were launched against Kiev. Of course, that is what the Russians say. Perhaps they did launch missiles against Kiev. Maybe the Ukrainians were able to shoot them down. I mean, I don't know, but that's what the Russians say. And I have to say that when it comes to these missile strikes, once again, I've tended to find Russian reporting a great deal more reliable than Ukrainian. I've just pointed out the discrepancies, shall we say, in Ukrainian counting of missiles shot down and targets hit. And given that, I tend to prefer what the Russians say on these types of issues. By the way, Newsweek is saying now that if missile strikes from Russia continue at the same levels of intensity, then at some point there will be a complete collapse of the Ukrainian energy system, and that could happen as soon as Christmas. Well, again, I'm not going to speculate about that, but clearly this was a devastating strike. It has done significant additional damage, and the problems of the Ukrainian energy system are intensifying. And whilst I am talking about this, I would say that there's been another fascinating article by John Helmer on his website, Dancing with Bears. And I have to say that I found it one of the most interesting and revealing articles about the overall military situation, and in fact, not just the military situation, but the situation in general in the conflict that he's written recently. And Helmer has been on a roll for some time. But anyway, he quotes an anonymous NATO infrastructure specialist who he's been in contact with. And this quotation, I'm going to read it because it gives some idea of the kind of challenges which Ukrainian officials trying to repair the damage after each of these strikes must be facing. Now, as I said, this is an anonymous source. I'm always worried about quoting anonymous sources, but for the record, the words seem to me to be genuine. And I want to also say that not only do they seem to be genuine, but I mean the overall description of events that this person describes are plausible. And by and large, I mean, in fact, I think Helmer is one of these people who one can rely upon for this kind of information. Anyway, this is what the article says. NATO infrastructure specialist explains utility technicians are more than likely trying but failing to make fast repairs in order to restore power. They're sure to be feeling the pressure from state officials. That is indisputably the case. Their management, the population, and of course the Russians, with all these missiles pouring in. They're overworked, underpaid, exhausted, and terrified. And that must also be true. I mean, missiles launched against systems that are under repair, it must be one of the most terrifying things that can happen to somebody who's tasked with carrying out those repairs. This means the likelihood of them making very dangerous technical mistakes is quite high. That also seems plausible to me. What you're seeing in photographs like these means untold numbers of appliances and sensitive electronic devices, computers and cell phones that are plugged in downstream are being destroyed. And Helmer also quotes a Kiev source saying telephone networks are breaking down unpredictably in the city. The only one operating normally is in Lvov, where the luxury hotel was full. The city restaurants are functioning as normal. It has more lights than Kiev. Well, that has probably been true at various occasions, but after this particular latest strike that took place, it seems that Lvov was actually more badly affected by that particular strike than Kiev was. So, perhaps if you're living in Lvov, you shouldn't be too complacent about the situation. Anyway, that was what Helmer says about the effectiveness of these strikes. I should say that over the course of yesterday, as yesterday was winding down, I also got lots of reports of Russian drone attacks across Ukraine. Now, interestingly, I never found out what the identity of these drones was. Over the last few weeks, there's been fewer drone attacks. We've had drone attacks by Uranium-2 drones seem to have largely stopped or entirely stopped. There's much speculation about why that is, whether the Russians have run through the stock of drones that Iran supplied to them, or whether they're hoarding drones as they're building them up in order to launch big strikes. Well, I don't know whether yesterday's drone attacks were carried out by Uranium-2 drones or not, whether the Russians, who are now busy, very busy, developing all kinds of drones, whether in fact these were different drones from the Uranium-2 drones we got so used to. But anyway, there do seem to have been drone attacks of some kind going on up and down Ukraine, mainly in the eastern regions, over the course of last night. But this morning, there have been very, very few details. Now, all of this, of course, continues to happen in conjunction with the situation on the battlefields. And we don't get a huge amount of news from the battlefields, but we are getting some. Now, Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, has been saying that the Russians are now making significant progress in Marinka. This is this town, formerly of 10,000 people, close to Donetsk, which the Ukrainians heavily fortified, and which they're apparently being pushed out from. There was a report yesterday which seemed very plausible that Ukraine is actually pulling some of its troops out of Marinka. It is holding on to some parts of Marinka. There's still fighting going on there, but that more and more Ukrainian troops are actually gradually being withdrawn from Marinka as the town gradually falls under Russian control. Now, this isn't just important in terms of the fighting in Marinka, because though the two places are not especially close to each other, fighting in Marinka, fighting in Vuhledar, apparently are connected to each other. If Marinka falls, Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar become extremely precarious, and by the way, as I understand it, vice versa. So it looks as if the situation there is further shifting in Russia's favor. It's obviously a hard, grueling battle, but it is indeed a battle which the Russians are steadily and incrementally winning. This is the battle in Marinka. And we had lots of reports yesterday about the fighting in Bakhmut. And there was a report from a Russian, or rather, I think he was from the Lugansk People's Republic, an official of the Lugansk People's Republic, who was saying that Ukrainian troops trying to defend Bakhmut are becoming increasingly demoralized because supplies of food and ammunition is becoming very sporadic, as the Russians now have essentially artillery ability to launch artillery strikes against all the roads leading into Bakhmut and the railway system. And this same official then gave an update over the following day. He said that despite the very difficult situation of the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut, it continues to be of enormous importance to Ukraine, so that they've actually sent more reinforcements again there. And this, I have to say, does remind me very much of comments made by none other than General Wesley Clark a short time ago, in which he talked about the Ukrainians having been lured into a trap in Bakhmut. Bakhmut apparently has been talked about much in Ukraine as a kind of fortress city. It was actually developed into a fortress. As I've said, I've heard that it's the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. Well, the risk of creating a fortress is that it becomes so important, so valuable that you have to defend it, in which case it becomes a trap. You have to constantly send troops, reinforcements there to hold it. It then becomes a kind of fire trap, a fire bag, as General Clark apparently said. I haven't seen the interview, by the way, but I've seen extensive reports about it. And that corresponds with the information that I've been getting about the situation in Bakhmut. And there's more reports, by the way, of continued Russian advances in and around Bakhmut, though it ought to be said that fighting remains very intense, and the Ukrainians are still strongly resisting and trying to maintain their positions in Bakhmut. One gets occasional reports that they've been pushed out of some of the areas, that they're concentrating more on defending the northern parts of Bakhmut rather than the southern suburbs and perhaps the central areas. But again, I'm not there. I can't give you an actual on-the-spot report because obviously I'm not on the spot. But it is a difficult, grinding battle, and there have been very, very heavy losses. And not just losses in men killed, but also losses in people wounded. And here again, the situation in terms of wounded people is covered once more by Helmer in that same article. And this time he's quoting an American source. Again, these sources are all anonymous. I would say that I would find it completely unsurprising that NATO sources and American sources, military sources, talking to Helmer would want to remain anonymous. So just wanted to make that point too. But this source speaks about field hospitals, triage areas, and ad hoc facilities to handle casualties. Schools, for example, will become charnel houses. Along with the trenches and dugouts, they're also riddled with disease. If they don't surrender, they'll literally rot. And like Korsun or even Stalingrad, these are battles obviously from the Second World War, in the early days of the pockets, there will not even be a meager airlift. And then Helmer goes on to provide a link to a report from American and Canadian military medical specialists on the treating of combat casualties in Afghanistan a decade ago. And we have this is, an open source report. I provided service to a Role 3 NATO hospital at Kandahar Airport. There is no way anything like that level of care will be available at Bakhmut, let alone in Liman, the Liman sector. The logistical support required to provide even a NATO forward operating base level of care is immense. Generators, fuel, refrigeration, medicines, diagnostic equipment, blood plasma, all have to be constantly replenished and maintained 24/7. I remember the panic when the generator broke down and we were told that we had less than 2 hours to get it working or a replacement tied in before the blood and medicine went bad. And we weren't under nearly the intensity of fire those on the Donbass front are. We didn't face nearly the logistical issues either. Those Ukrainian aid stations and hospitals will be a nightmare in short order if they are not already. If I were a Russian, I would not want to have contact with prisoners. They'll be teeming with who knows what. Well, that's a rather harrowing report, harrowing claims. I have to say that they are consistent with reports that I am seeing, that these hospitals, there's field hospitals in Liman, in Konstantinovka, in Bakhmut itself, and the situation I'm getting is that the situation in these hospitals and casualty stations and the rest, it's becoming increasingly grim. Now, I don't want to harp on this, but again, I am astonished that in the 22nd century, in the 21st century, sorry, not 22nd, the 21st century, in the year 2022, we are, in Europe, we are back at this situation. And I read these things. I not just read these things, I see pictures and photographs, many of them, by the way, from Ukrainian sources, of the conditions Ukrainian soldiers are fighting under in Bakhmut. I can see from these sources corroboration of the claims that soldiers in this area are short of food, short of fuel, short of ammunition. There's a report, which I can't confirm, that Ukrainian soldiers trying to keep themselves warm in these difficult conditions are lighting fires, which of course means that they can be easily located by Russian artillery. They're told not to, supposedly, but they have no choice because otherwise they will get unbearably cold. Well, I cannot fathom or understand how something like this can be allowed to happen. And Bakhmut is being held for the moment by Ukraine, but at what cost? And nobody disputes the high casualties, but it isn't just a question of the fact that people are dying, it's also how they are dying, which, I mean, ought to be a matter of enormous concern. And by the way, I've now also seen a Ukrainian official, Mr. Gadai, who is, by the way, the Ukrainian appointed governor of Lugansk region, which of course is no longer under Ukrainian control, but he's still nominally Ukraine's governor of Lugansk region. He's now talking about a Russian threat to Kupiansk, this place in Kharkiv region, captured by the Ukrainians over the course of their counteroffensive in September. So it looks as if they are facing pressure there, though it must be said Gadai rather poo-pooed the idea that the Russians would be able to recapture Kupiansk. Perhaps he's right. Perhaps that's not the Russian objective. But we're also getting reports, this time from the Russian side, from a Russian appointed official in Zaporozhye, that on the Zaporozhye front, where there were all those ambitions, expectations a few weeks ago that the Ukrainians were going to launch some great offensive, pushing all the way to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. Anyway, this Russian official claims there that the Russians are gradually regaining the initiative in Zaporozhye, that it is they who are pushing forward and the Ukrainians who are being pushed back, rather than vice versa. So, terrible things happening on the Ukrainian side. Bad things happening on the Russian side too. I don't want to pretend that all the misery and suffering is on just one side in the war. The Russians are again reporting heavy shelling of Donetsk. A significant number of people were killed over the last couple of hours from this Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk. A Russian official has said that even if Avdiivka and Marinka and all of these places are recaptured or captured by the Russians over the next few weeks, Ukrainian missile artillery will still be able to launch missile strikes against Donetsk. The Ukrainians realistically would have to be pushed 90 kilometers from Donetsk before that shelling stops. And there was also a report yesterday that a Russian Sukhoi-24 strike aircraft was shot down by the Ukrainian air defenses in the area of presumably Bakhmut. Now I say that because one of the curiosities is that this particular Sukhoi-24 bomber, it's rather an old Soviet era aircraft. I believe the Russian Air Force does still operate it, but it's been gradually phased out and replaced with the much more advanced and much more modern Sukhoi-34. But anyway, this particular aircraft was operated by contract pilots flying for and under contract to the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group seems to be evolving into quite an elaborate military force, ground troops, together with an air force of some sort. I've heard earlier reports that the Wagner Group is also operating Sukhoi-25 ground attack aircraft. So this is quite a major development, or so it seems to me, that the Wagner Group is able to operate aircraft as well as ground troops. And I must wonder whether perhaps there aren't some people in the Russian Defense Ministry who are becoming a little concerned that this private army that the Wagner Group is supposed to be is becoming a little bit too big and a little bit too evolved. Though, as I've said in a video where I discussed it in more detail, perhaps it should be better understood as a kind of Russian equivalent of a foreign legion, of the French Foreign Legion, even though the vast bulk of the personnel who join it are, of course, Russians. And I don't have any doubt myself that the Russian Ministry of Defense has been involved in setting it up and in funding it. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this. Now, we are also getting reports, however, I mean, I've talked about Ukrainian losses, I've talked about Russian losses. To be very clear, Ukrainian losses do seem to be much heavier. And as I said, I've not seen film or pictures of anything coming from the Russian side that is comparable to the really awful, harrowing pictures that I'm seeing from the Ukrainian side. Russian military are forbidden to carry mobile phones with them, so perhaps they aren't able to photograph things that they see. But I can't help but think that if there were really horrors like that on the Russian side, something would have come through. We would be seeing some kind of pictures comparable to those that we're getting from the Ukrainians about the horrors that they're working under. Anyway, what we are also seeing from the Russian side is lots of new equipment. And supposedly, well, I've seen pictures, so perhaps supposedly is not the case. Actually, perhaps the Russian military in Donbass have now received a delivery of 200 T-90M tanks. These are state-of-the-art tanks, as good as anything that the Russian army has. And the Ural Vagon Zavod factory in the Urals, which builds all these tanks, it's by far Russia's biggest tank factory, also says that it's provided the Russian military with a whole large number of refurbished T-72 tanks. The T-90s, by the way, are almost certainly new production. So we're seeing a steady incremental build-up of Russian tank forces. Now, coming back, however, to Helmer and his article, he is at pains to point out over the course of his article that the Russians are not in any spectacular hurry in this campaign, military campaign. And there's an article which has appeared in Zero Hedge by the American-based Russian writer Dmitry Orlov, who makes the same point, that the Russians can advance. They're carrying out their incremental advances in Ukraine, but they're not pushing forward too fast or excessively fast, because the tempo of the war suits them. If they advanced too quickly, two things might happen. Firstly, they would suffer much heavier losses, which they want to avoid for obvious reasons. And secondly, there might be an over-rapid advance, triggering a major crisis for the Ukrainian government, might put pressure on the West to respond in some way. So the Russians, this particular tempo that they are adopting for the war, serves that kind of purpose. It enables them to achieve their objectives, even if gradually and incrementally, and it has a kind of logic to it. Well, that is a view, and I know that there are many people who would disagree, and who would think that the Russians are being altogether too slow, and perhaps that they're at risk of allowing Ukraine to rebuild its forces again by taking this altogether too slow. If they continue, of course, the Russians continue, of course, in this way. But I'm going to add 2 points from Orlov's, well, a number of points from Orlov's article. Firstly, he makes a point which I personally agree with, that he says he's been observing Putin for many decades, as have I, by the way, and at no point has Putin seemed as relaxed and cheerful as he has over the last few weeks. And actually, I don't disagree. Now, this could be an act, but it's a difficult act to keep up, and certainly Putin has never given the impression that he feels under any particular personal stress or pressure over the course of this war. And Orlov makes a further point which does repay significant additional discussion, that one of the effects of this long duration of the war is that it is giving the Russians time and space to carry a very significant restructuring of the way their economy is organized. Now, this is a big topic, and I'm going to come back to it at some point in the future. It's too big a topic to discuss in this program. Anyway, where are we? What can we say about the general position from all of this? Well, briefly, I would suggest 2 things. Firstly, all of this hideous talk about a meat grinder, from Prigozhin, about a trap from Wesley Clark, about grinding the Ukrainian forces down from General Surovikin. Well, we see that in action. Helmer has provided some of he's fleshed out what that actually means, the immense stress that Ukraine is coming under. Newsweek talks about a collapse of the energy system before Christmas. That may or may not be true. I'm not going to speculate, but Helmer talks about the enormous stress that Ukrainian technicians must be under as they try to keep the system running and of that I have no doubt, Orlov and Helmer talk about the enormous hurt, the way in which the Russians are conducting the military campaign, the way in which losses are mounting because of Ukraine's attempts to cling on to its positions in Donbass, how that is playing into the tactics that General Surovikin is following. And again, that seems to be true, and Helmer has provided us with an insight as to what that actually means for people who are fighting this war on the Ukrainian side. And altogether, and in summary, this is a grim picture, very different from the way in which this war is being reported in the West. The talk about, Ukrainian advances and counteroffensives, a slowing of the tempo that Errol Haynes, the US Director of National Intelligence, was discussing also a couple of days ago at this conference at the Ronald Reagan Center, or whatever it was. The realities on the ground point to an increasingly grim picture. And unfortunately, I come back to that point which I've made many times. A negotiated solution would seem to be both possible and at the same time is not being seriously sought by anyone. And there's been some really interesting, but I would have thought from a Western point of view, rather worrying articles about the Russian outlook. It's been pointed out, for example, that when Putin met the mothers of the serving soldiers at that meeting, which I discussed about a week ago, he spoke about how the Minsk agreement had been a mistake, how Russia should have moved forward to sort out, to complete the liberation, as he would say, and the unification of Donbass to Russia way back in 2014. And of course, a point has been made about how that shows that Putin himself is not going to be interested. He isn't really interested any longer in a Minsk 3. If Minsk 2 was a mistake, why would Minsk 3 be any different? The Russians publicly continue to say that they are in favor of a diplomatic solution, that they're open to discussions about Ukraine with the Americans, with the Europeans, with the Ukrainians themselves. But Putin's words suggest that realistically they no longer actually believe that such a negotiated settlement is possible. And there's also been a fair amount of commentary. There's a very interesting article about this by Scott Ritter in Consortium News, for example, who points out that Angela Merkel's interview in Der Spiegel will have reinforced Russian doubts about the merits of a negotiated agreement. Going back to that interview, Merkel's interview to Der Spiegel, I discussed previously what a deeply cynical article that was, how it failed to take Russian concerns seriously. It assumed that the Russians could continue to be manipulated, and that Merkel seems to have bitter feelings about the fact that she was no longer around to continue to manipulate the Russians, as she appears to have believed that she could continue to do. Well, that was the part of the interview that I focused on, but Scott Ritter and a number of other people, Glenn Deason, for example, have focused on another part. And this is the part in which Merkel also says, like Poroshenko, the former Ukrainian president, says, that she never really took the Minsk agreement seriously, that she always assumed that the Ukrainians were going to disregard the Minsk agreement. She never intended to try to get Minsk to work. The entire purpose of the Minsk agreement, it was simply a device to buy Ukraine time in order to build up its military capacity so that it could resist Russia better and by implication recapture Donbass by force and do all of those things. Now, I have to say this, I happen to believe that when Merkel says all of these things in Der Spiegel, she's not telling the truth. I think that Merkel is trying to say these things now because, well, she's defending herself from criticism in Germany that she got too close to the Russians. So, of course, she is saying all of these things about Minsk now, pretending that she never really believed in it and it was all a clever trick to deceive the Russians, because that is her best defense, if you like, in Germany today. That's what it seems to me Merkel is doing. I remember Minsk very well. I remember articles that were appearing in Der Spiegel at the time of the Minsk agreement, shortly after the Minsk agreement, which were clearly emanating from Merkel's office, which suggested that Merkel at that time believed that not only would Minsk be implemented, but that in fact the Ukrainians had to acknowledge the fact that they had irretrievably lost both Donbass and Crimea. And of course, shortly after, Merkel revived the Nord Stream 2 project with the Russians, which I don't think she would have done if she'd really imagined or intended that there would be a resumption of the war in Ukraine at some point, and a case of the Ukrainians overrunning Donbass. But anyway, that's my own view, and I know there will be an awful lot of people who disagree and who will push back on that. But my point is not whether Merkel is telling the truth now. My point at this moment is that, of course, the Russians, including Putin himself, will be reading that Der Spiegel article. I've no doubt at all that this article will have been forwarded to Putin and he will have read it, and he speaks German, and he will have read it in the original. And he will be seeing how Merkel today is telling the German media, Der Spiegel, the German people, that in fact she tricked Putin way back in 2015. Now, what is Putin supposed to think after he reads something like that? I mean, Merkel was somebody that he worked with very closely. It's well known that the two didn't particularly like each other or get on, but they did work together very closely, and they did reach all kinds of agreements and understandings with each other, and they also routinely exchanged gifts. Merkel used to send Putin beer from a Saxon beer, and Putin used to respond by, I think it was vodka or caviar or something that he used to send to Merkel in return. I can't remember what it was. But anyway, all of this. And now he reads in Der Spiegel, Merkel herself telling the German people, well, actually, when I brokered Minsk II, which it's now known, it was her basic idea to get this agreement put together. When I brokered Minsk II way back in February 2015, I was tricking the Russians. I was deceiving them. my meetings with Putin, my personal, private, one-to-one meeting that I had then with Putin in the Kremlin was basically a deception. I was pulling the wool over his eyes. I did the same in Minsk. Well, why, reading all of that, would Putin in that case trust any other German leader? Other German leaders who have been a lot less, shall we say, willing to work with him than Merkel was. Why would Putin assume that any agreement, any proposal made to him by the Germans, by the Europeans, by the Western powers, by the United States has any value? So yes, the Russians go through the motions of saying, well, yes, of course, we're prepared to sit down with Ukraine. We're prepared to have these discussions with the Ukrainians. We tried really hard back in March. Didn't work. We weren't to blame for the fact that it all fell apart then, but we're willing to talk with the Ukrainians. We're open to a diplomatic solution. But why would the Russians actually think that a diplomatic solution is the way to end this war? So, Scott Ritter makes the point in this article in Consortium News that this isn't going to end well. And of course he's right. You can't conduct negotiations in the way that Merkel says that she conducted the negotiations that led to Minsk. In other words, with duplicity and deception, without this having consequences. And the consequence in this case is that on any topic relating to Ukraine, trust between the Russians and the West has completely broken down. I suspect that is true about any other topic as well. And in light of that, getting a negotiated settlement now is going to be incredibly difficult. At the very least, there will have to be, and at least Macron seems to understand it, not just agreements about Minsk, about Ukraine itself, but any diplomatic solution to the problem of Ukraine. And I have spoken about the harrowing conditions that are happening on the front lines in places like Bakhmut, which show why that negotiated solution is imperative on humanitarian grounds. Any diplomatic solution is going to have to address that massive problem of trust. And as Macron says, that means that there will have to be the kind of security guarantees offered to the Russians which they can actually this time trust. I don't think we're in anywhere close to seeing that happen. I'm afraid Ukraine itself, which might have sought a negotiated solution with the Russians, has been persuaded to close that option off, and I don't really see how it's going to change. That's going to change. So all of the factors point to a long, grinding war, Ukraine paying the price, and the rupture between Russia and Europe becoming permanent. A deeply depressing outcome to someone like me, who remembers the optimism at the end of the Cold War. But there we are. Well, I think I've spoken again for long enough, almost an hour. So this is a good moment to stop. Let me remind you again that you can find us on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. That you can also get various things from our shop, various amazing merchandise from our shop, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all those things. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And of course, if you want to, if you've liked this video, remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.